Hello everyone and welcome to this bobsguide seminar. I am Sarjan Raja and I'm currently the editor of Payment-Eye, which is an industry news analysis tool for professionals working in the payment space, and I'll be mediating on behalf of bobsguide today. So the subject for today's webinar is the evolving payments landscape, an overview of the last decade and the coming one, and what should you do to get ready. So the purpose of today's seminar, it's being run in conjunction with Bottomline Technologies, and what we're really aiming to do is provide you with an overview of the rapid developments that have been going on in the payments field in the UK and around the world. And this really comes at a time as new real-time electronic infrastructures are being rolled out, and new direct debit formats advance, and regulations such as SEPA are hitting alongside new fraud and risk rules. E-invoicing and global XML messaging are also on the fray. So the aim really is to give payment professionals, corporate treasurers, finance directors and others involved in the financial supply chain a template to take best advantage of modern payment practices and technologies. In particular, today's webinar will look at how the payments landscape in the UK has changed over the past decade. So we'll be referencing the 10th anniversary of the start of the Bacstel-IP migration, the subsequent development of the faster payment service, the compliance which is now associated with Paperless Direct Debits, and also HMRC's Real Time Information system. We'll also be addressing international developments on the front, such as Single European Payments Area for credit transfers, and also SEPA Direct Debits, with a view to making recommendations about how you should prepare for 2020 and beyond. So we're very happy to be running this webinar today with our sponsors Bottomline. There will also be an opportunity for interactive questions and answers at the end of this hour-long presentation. So to introduce our speakers we'll be hearing shortly from, we have Richard Ransom, who's a payment specialist with Bottomline Technologies, and James Richardson, who's a Bottomline technical payments consultant. But before we go any further, however, there are a few housekeeping rules and points I'd like to raise. So firstly, if you have a question to ask our speakers, please go to the box on your screen and simply type it in. What I'll then do is I'll use it at the end of the hour-long webinar today, and time permitting during the short Q&A session at the end, we'll try and fire those along to our speakers. So the entire webinar will also be recorded. If you have missed anything or think a colleague would be interested later on, you'll be sent a link to the recording which you'll be able to access. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker today, who will be providing this payments overview. Richard, over to you.
Hi there, thank you Sajjan. This is James Richardson here from Bottomline Technologies. Hello and welcome. Good afternoon, whereverabouts you're based. I'm James Richardson, I'm the head of pre-sales for Bottomline, and I'm joined today by my colleague Richard Ransom, who's the Payments Product Marketing Manager for Bottomline. And we're going to take you through this presentation, and as Sajjan says, if there's opportunity to take questions at the end, then we'll take those, but feel free to post them through to the Q&A section, as Sajjan explained at the beginning of the call. So a very brief introduction to Bottomline Technologies, and then we'll move into the meat of the presentation. So Bottomline are a NASDAQ-listed global organization with headquarters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and a European head office in Reading in the UK. We have over 11,000 customers globally, and 9,000 of those sit within the UK. We have around 1,300 employees worldwide and have award-winning product innovation. Bottomline's products and services are used worldwide, and we have customers of all sizes and verticals. And here are some examples of our customers across the Fortune 100, FTSE 100, 13 of the top 25 insurance companies, and 15 of the top 25 global banks.
Thank you, James. I'm Richard Ransom, as James said, the Payments Product Marketing Manager for EMEA with Bottomline. Just to give you an idea of our pedigree in the payments market, especially in the UK, we've been selling electronic payment solutions for over 20 years and check solutions for longer than that. At the moment, 60% of all organisations that connect to Bacs use Bottomline software, and we're responsible for about 43% of all transactions. So today's webinar, we're going to take a look back at 10 years ago. We're going to come right to the present day and then look forward another 10 years. Now, what we've found, speaking to our customers and our experience in this market, is that a lot of people bought their payment solutions and last looked at their payments processes back in 2004. So still using the same technology they used back then. So if you look at this slide, there's a few things to pick out on here. We've got an old Audi A4, so at the time very efficient, a very good car, but nowadays that 10-year-old car isn't going to be as efficient. It'll be less safe than other cars on the road. You won't be able to take advantage of things like ABS, sat-nav, etc. I think the Facebook was launched 10 years ago, which doesn't seem that long ago now, but we've also seen advances in mobile technology. Although there's a BlackBerry on the screen there, back in 2004, people predominantly used BlackBerries just for email. I know plenty of business users who had a BlackBerry for email and a real phone for phoning. It's worth sort of picking out some of the tech trends back in 2004 as well. The CEO of Nokia reckoned that 2/3 of phones would eventually have cameras in them within 10 years. And iTunes managed to sell its 100 millionth tune in 2004. By 2013, that's 250 billion. So the world's moved on considerably since then. Checks, to move it back to the payment sphere, were a predominant AP payment method. And although we've got pictures of diskettes on there, it wasn't that long in 2004 since Bacs had stopped accepting diskettes as a primary method of payment. So since 2004, 2004 was the start of the Bacstel-IP migration. Myself and James were both involved in that process, and we visited and helped hundreds of organisations with that migration. At the time, that was quite a big change. People had a lot of notice, and people didn't tend to move till the very end of the migration period, and that's a pattern we've seen up to the present day with regulatory changes. At the time, cheques were predominant. Cash was still a popular collection method. I know a lot of local authorities still had a lot of cash coming in. CHAPS was the only way to really make a same-day payment, and CHAPS payments then were as expensive as they are now. Cards were being seen as being a nascent technology for business-to-business payments. What we've seen is that really hasn't happened. The rise in cards hasn't come along as it was expected to at the time. Operating systems have really moved on since 2004. Any ones that you were using in 2004 are end of life now. We're just seeing XP going end of life now. 2000 was end of life a while back. So technology's moved on. Deployments have moved on. Back in 2004, people were wary of the internet as a way to send their Bacs payments. Now we had a lot of conversations with customers about how safe it actually was to use the internet. And at the time, a lot of customers still attached PCs to modems that sat in the corner of an office off their network and carried their data files across the office on a floppy disk, and later on USB sticks. So things haven't changed for a lot of organisations. Internet banking was still in its infancy, and the more common method of attaching yourself to a bank was using a dial-up modem or some sort of leased line technology if you were a very big organisation. So since then, organisations have, we hoped, focused on better streamlining payments processes. They've moved from manual back-office processing to automated lights-out processing. Now, back at Bacstel-IP time, before Bacstel-IP came along, there was no way to automate Bacstel submissions without building huge lists of Bacstel-IP passwords and building a very insecure process. Once upon a time, it was fine to have your Bacs payment software running on a piece of hardware in the corner of an office, accessed by a single user, and that typically was someone in IT. So a lot of organisations would leave the final submission of data to someone in IT rather than someone in finance. The danger of relying on those single points of control and one person behind the system can be borne out in these few examples from the past 6 months or so. We have a £30,000 cheque fraud over 5 years where there wasn't sufficient control within the office to stop someone fraudulently writing cheques. In fact, this Tuesday, a news story came out where a council clerk managed to steal £57,000 in 5 weeks through cheque fraud because there was insufficient control around the process. Now, there are very few excuses now to use cheques as a primary payment method. I know there are some acceptance issues, but for businesses there shouldn't be those acceptance issues. Business-to-business cheques are an inefficient way of making a payment and expensive. When we talk about some customer examples, James will cover one of those, a surprisingly large organisation that still used cheques till very recently. The other story you've got on there is about an accountant embezzling thousands of pounds from payroll, and that fraud was signalled down to Bacs software. I hasten to add, not Bottomline's Bacs payment software. But it was obvious in that organisation there wasn't sufficient control around the process to stop someone just continually making fraudulent Bacs payments. So organisations who are still using the same solution they were using 10 years ago, and that's very common, need to look at their business process and their workflow. And that's a theme we're going to touch upon. I make no apologies for talking about that quite a lot during the presentation.
So, I'd like you to cast your mind back to 1996. I'd like you to cast your mind back through to 1996, where corporates were given the ability to connect to Bacstel through a dial-up modem, and at that point in time it was seen as a bit of a revolution. This was typically green screen, computer terminal, a PC in a corner, typically a locked room off the back of a finance department. And as time has moved on, and we look now to 2004, as Richard has said, every organisation around that point in time had to change. And this, of course, was with the introduction of Bacstel-IP. And organisations were given a 2-year window to make that move, given 2 years of notice. And the interesting thing with that, when you look at the difference between 96 and 2004, is, and Richard mentioned this earlier, organisations starting to embrace the internet with file submissions. Although, hasten to add, with great reluctance, and Richard and I were both on the front line at that point in time, having conversations with customers about how you can connect to Bacs. But also finance departments changed. They got bigger as their organisations got bigger, and there was a wider demand on departmental access rather than one particular PC locked away in a corner, or multi-departmental access, such as payroll or other areas of the business having access to the system. And in the last 10 years, we've seen a further shift. And technology is an example of how this has changed. Software in itself has moved on. So we've seen multiple iterations of Microsoft Windows and other platforms. Hardware in itself has moved on. Processors have got faster. Hardware itself has got smaller. And we've seen the birth of virtual machines really being adopted into corporates. And more recently, hosted and cloud type solutions, not just for Bacs but for any type of business application, has started to become more prevalent in conversations. I think the other thing is there's been a social attitude to change here, and certainly at the time back in 2004, less than 10% of customers wanted to send their files through the internet. But now it's very much the de facto standard, so that change and appreciation of how technology has moved on and changed has helped that adoption. And over the last 10 years, we've seen service changes or additions to services, such as direct corporate access, where you have the ability to make faster payments. Currently, if you're a Barclays-sponsored corporate, you have the ability to make same-day payments, which we will talk about later on within the presentation. Also, we've seen HMRC RTI, and I'm sure many of you have seen this come through. Your HR departments, your payroll departments have been receiving communication on this, and that's been rolled out. SEPA is something that's been very much talked about over the last decade, but only very recently has it started to gain traction in terms of its adoption. The other thing is how organisations consume all of this technology has evolved too. So now we talk very much about browser-based solutions rather than software installed onto a PC. And there's a general trend within organisations to wanting to have immediate access to data or information, and certainly improve their visibility across the organisation, not just have information sat within a finance department. And this trend, whether it's social or through technology supporting it, is driving this expectation of now. I want information now. And the last piece on here is the change of people working. And we're seeing this with more home workers, people having multiple laptops or PCs. So having software installed on one particular PC just doesn't work, just doesn't fit with how organisations work today.
Thank you, James. So as we've seen from that timeline, lots of innovation in the last 10 years around payments. The way that people have made payments has changed. But have organisations moved forward? Now, we've seen plenty that haven't or aren't necessarily aware of the changes that have happened. So today, a business can rely on BACS, faster payments, CHAPS, checks are still around. SEPA is an area that they can actually gain positive benefit from. International payments over SWIFT is an area that was previously only accessible via e-banking solutions. Banks were suspicious. SWIFT was suspicious of corporates using their SWIFT network 10 years ago. Now, use of SWIFT is actually actively encouraged by SWIFT. They bought out lighter versions of their gateways and allowed many bureau to flourish and provide corporate payment access to the SWIFT network. Cards, as we said, didn't take off as was expected 10 years ago, but are still there. Mobile as a way of receiving payments is something that we know will increase. And internet bank transfers are now commonplace. So internet banking is a lot more sophisticated than it was 10 years ago. And as James mentioned, we have an expectation now as a consumer of getting payments instantly, because I can pay James immediately £5 if I wanted to. But businesses are now expecting the same level of service. If you look at how those payment types have changed and the mix has shifted, in 2002, 668 million checks are processed compared to only 247 million in 2012. Now that number will drop off. Obviously the new check imaging, which I'll talk about a bit later, will slow the tail down of that decline. But as we said, business-to-business checks are really on decline. The introduction of faster payments in 2008, not just for consumers but for businesses, are seeing the way that people make their payments change. We've noticed that. We thought initially when direct corporate access to faster payments, so this is a service that's analogous to BACS, was introduced, that people would use it for disaster recovery for their normal payment methods. And what we've seen is payroll organisations using it for weekly payroll, and organisations now using it as a cash flow method. So making a payment when they know there are funds in their account to cover it. Obviously, payment service providers have leapt upon faster payments as a great way to deliver money and deliver funds to organisations and people. So another thing that's happened really in those 10 years is a change in bank relationships. Organisations in 2004 were looking at reducing and consolidating bank relationships. But what happened when the credit crisis hit is that banks that people never expected to fall over became very risky, and people have looked at they're still consolidating bank relationships, but not as much as not down to one bank. So they want to spread their risk across multiple institutions. What that's meant with that loss of faith in large institutions is people now acquire multiple point solutions for their payment types. Well, depending on how large an organisation you are will depend on the sort of solution you'll get from your bank, and you may have internet banking from a number of your banks, you may have direct connection for another one, and a back solution as well, and separately a way of printing checks from another system. So we found that people have multiple solutions, and what that's meant is that it becomes very difficult to reconcile your payments and get a single view of your cash flow. So people will spend a lot of time. We know, I spoke to a logistics business recently where someone spends half a day a week collating reports from different point banking solutions to get to a final cash position. So where you do business is really important as well. So 2004, your business might have just been trading locally within the UK and may have had very low volumes of payment of trade within Europe or outside of Europe. Obviously, the credit crisis and the various recessions have meant that people have looked further afield to get into markets. I was listening to something from the British Chambers of Commerce recently where they were saying there was a large move into Europe for trade. So organisations were realising that market wasn't so far away, was easy to communicate with. But that means that you're entering into a new world of payments. So rather than entering in multiple European payments using SWIFT, you've now got the availability of SEPA as an organisation. The corporate connectivity to SWIFT, as I mentioned, is now encouraged and well established, and that can help you build some bank agnosticity. So you can have one platform for all of your payments and push those payments out to the different banks because the standards are all the same. And if we talk around standards, SWIFT has its own set of standards, but introduction of SEPA has brought ISO 20022 to the fore, and as I'll talk a bit later, that's not just a SEPA payment format now, that's being looked at for other countries. Other countries will use it, and initiatives such as CGI are going to see wider adoption of that. Legislation and regulation are always important, but these have become more and more key as time has moved on. Fraud becomes more sophisticated. So there's an increase in the need for bank validation to reduce fraud. ID verification, that's not just for people, that's also for businesses as well. Is this person who's given me his bank details a legitimate business? Is this an attempt at an invoice fraud? Do I need to look at measures to prevent anti-money laundering? Am I dealing with the right sorts of people? If I'm not a financial institution, do I need to look at the sort of controls that financial institutions have around AML? What we've also seen in the regulation sphere is that HMRC Real Time Information legislation that has put some extra data in your BACS file, but also around that UK domestic BACS processing. The current account switch service means any business, whether you're making payments or collections, needs to receive your BACS reports and act upon them. BACS and the banks are actively looking for organisations that aren't doing this. If you're collecting direct debits and you aren't taking account of your return messages, those A reports, then you're in danger of losing the ability to collect by direct debit. Direct debit indemnity claim automation also has changed the way that things are processed. It's removed manual processing, but it's meant you've had to be a lot more on top of the data that comes back into your solution. So if you are currently going to the BACS website to download those things, that can become an inefficient process. So doing that through a piece of software that also submits your BACS payments is also a good idea. We're also seeing a wider adoption of paperless direct debit. That brings with it the need for more verification and the need to comply with more rules.
Thanks, Richard. With disaster recovery, we've seen very much an attitude change as well as a technology change over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, disaster recovery was very much seen as another PC with the same software just replicated from your main production PC. And today it's expected to be a seamless transition with always on or always available in mind. And the thing is with DR now, the impact of failure is far greater in reputational terms, with social media influencing a lot of that. And we meet customers, we've done so over the years, who say, never had a problem in 10 years, and of course they'll default to nothing. To doing nothing, they'll just stay with what they've got. And as an example, we met an organisation who said exactly that, and then 2 weeks later, sadly, they missed the payroll date due to a failure. And as a consequence of that, they had to pay their 18,000 staff through CHAPS, which at that time, the cost of making this same-day CHAPS payment was £85,000 to pay those 18,000 staff. Now, faster payments is becoming a form of sort of business continuity, if you like, or disaster recovery for some organisations, but because it allows organisations to make that same-day payment rather than relying on the 3-day payment processing for BACS. But it's worth remembering, of course, that there is no such equivalent for collections. With automation, 10 years ago, the level of automation was fairly low. But today, organizations are evolving to automate more, but still retain control over the process. And visibility outside of finance is being demanded more, which means access to the same systems across the company. And certainly we're seeing a growing need for blended solutions for flexibility. So as an example, offering complete automation straight through processes for sending collection files out from your ERP or business application, and then bringing all of the reports back in automatically as well, and updating all of the records. But conversely, for payments, they still want to retain that extra level of control and final check on the file before it gets through to Bacs. So it could be the same organization, but just a different approach to automation, depending on the application type that we're talking about. In terms of deployment types, this is quite interesting. This is a big technology play here. 20 years ago, everything was hardware. 10 years ago, everything was software. Now, organizations are looking to have the same level of functionality, but consume it in different ways. And this has risen with the uptake of cloud or hosted solutions, and even API integrating with your business application. But still very much we see software as an important part of organizations. The important thing for us, and we get this from all of our customers, is that the business needs should determine the right solution, not their size. So, financial transactions, they form the lifeblood of organizations. And what I want to talk about here is why this is important. So for direct debits, this is all about cash flow, all about bringing money into the organization and ensuring that the cash is there where it needs to be when you plan it to be, and having visibility of that within your organization so you can plan ahead. The same is true, of course, for employee payments, and I gave an example of that story of a retailer that had to make the CHAPS payments. But it's absolutely critical to be able to pay your employees on time. But it doesn't stop with that, of course. Suppliers, there's a risk with certain suppliers of no goods or services coming into your organization. And in extreme cases, depending on your type of business, they may down tools. And in the days of just-in-time delivery and lean, this is really critical. This is important. So why change? If you've been doing the same thing as you've always done, it's not been broken, there's no reason, you're not feeling any pain, why do it? I guess the question from us is, do you have a payment strategy? Many organizations were forced to take changes and make those changes 10 years ago, and as I said before, they were given 2 years' notice with Bacs-IP. But these were often just seen as tactical changes. We've just got to make a change because someone is telling us to do so, rather than stepping back and looking at the wider picture of your business needs. The same has been true since Bacs-IP, and we've seen this with upgrades, replacing like-for-like applications when organizations are forced to through external events like Microsoft end-of-lifing Windows 2000 and XP. So the question is, do you have a payment strategy that aligns with the direction of your organization? Are you looking at the cost of payments, the transaction rates, low-value same-day payments for faster payment service and banking means that there's much more attractive competition. And more organizations need to consider direct corporate access and international payments. And when you talk about SEPA as well, being able to transact in Europe but being able to benefit from that low-cost domestic tariff for making pan-European payments is also very attractive, but often widely considered as outside of the scope of their payment hub or their payment solution and is managed with a bank. There's operations efficiency to consider, with multiple payment types across the business that can form together to create a single payment hub or platform, reducing the amount of resource and focus on the core business. And I've got some examples that I wanted to share with you here. We've got a Bottomline customer, a large media organization, who had multiple disparate business applications working with multiple banks in routing all of their outbound payments. And what we were able to do is bring all of that together into a single payment hub. And I'm not just talking about Bacs. Yes, there was Bacs, but also faster payments through direct corporate access, CHAPS, SEPA payments, and other cross-border payments via SWIFT, which meant that they could reduce the number of payment terminals and give the visibility of all the transactions at any time. We have a large retailer with a head office in the UK who moved from paying checks to suppliers into Bacs, which may sound a bit archaic, but as Richard said, it's absolutely critical if you want to be reducing cost and gain better and tighter control of your process, reducing fraud risk. And what they were able to do was save £1.50 per item, essentially. And that gave them increased control by adding multiple level workflow into their process. Another one that we've seen is a growing, an emerging market, if you like, over the last few years has been payday loan companies who consume the technology in a very different way. They're interested in making faster payments, predominantly or solely faster payments to transfer cash into accounts. And what they require is a high degree of automation, all the way from onboarding customers, verifying who they are, being able to tie the individual to their account and ensure that you're paying the right individual, of course, but then automate fully the process of sending the payment file through into their bank account.
So where are we going to next? I think we've had a good summary of 10 years ago where we are now. I think moving forward, in terms of payment types, we've seen steady growth in business-to-business direct debit in the UK, despite the fact there aren't any special schemes like there are for SEPA. So lots of organisations are looking at direct debit as a good way to collect payment. It's a very cost-effective way. It's not just utilities are doing that; manufacturing businesses as well are doing it too. What we'd like to see, and where we'd like to see the UK moving to, is more alignment with a SEPA-style business-to-business direct debit, which is a bit friendlier in terms of indemnity, but that shouldn't stop organisations considering it. Business-to-business direct debit is also a great way of tying up invoicing process as well, so you can really automate with direct debit, get away from some of those high-cost processes. In the UK, as we said, cheques were meant to be disappearing in 2018. They're very much with us for as long as people want to use them. But the Treasury's recent announcement of legislation on cheque imaging and the work that was done last year by Cheque and Credit Company, showing that we're going to possibly in the UK, or most definitely move the UK towards Check 21 style cheque imaging like they have in the US, where you'll be able to take a picture of a cheque, you'll be able to throw away the piece of paper and that cheque will still get processed. That will reduce a lot of cost in the receipt of cheques. That doesn't mean as a business that you should still issue cheques, as Bacs payments are still much more efficient than that. I talked a little bit about ISO 20022. So what we've seen around that file format is that groups such as Common Global Implementation are looking at how that ISO 20022 XML can be used for domestic payments anywhere globally. So I know lots of other payment systems are starting to look at 20022, not least the UK. So the Payments Council have announced in their roadmap they're looking at ISO 20022 potentially for UK payments, not just as a way to replace the normal payments and let the market decide, but also to try and drive some sort of richer data functionality. Now, one thing that ISO 20022 gives above the BAC Standard 18 format is reference information. BAC Standard 18 has 18 characters to carry all of your remittance information, your invoice information, and obviously the ISO format allows you to put a lot more in there. Wider use of faster payments, as we said before. Direct corporate access to faster payments, which is analogous to Bacstel-IP, is only available at the moment for Barclays-sponsored customers. Another one of the main banks will be adopting direct corporate access later this year, and we expect the other two big banks to follow very soon after. Once we have more than one bank offering that service, remember it's bank agnostic. It will be something you can push to the same software that you do your Bacs payments through, albeit with an extra module. what we should see is some price competition, and we'll see some larger players starting to look at faster payments as a really viable way to make payments. Now, I don't think faster payments will replace standard scheduled payments like your normal accounts payable run or your normal payroll, but other types of ad hoc payments will start to move towards that method. I've also talked about mobile here. Now, mobile payments will remain primarily in the consumer world, but as we've seen this week from the announcement from the Payments Council of the Pay-M service, there are going to be smaller business adoption. People are really looking at these products as a way to drive payments into businesses. So with Pay-M, your business can link a mobile number to a collection account, and consumers can pay you via their mobile banking apps to a phone number rather than having to give out bank details. With the Barclays Ping It service, which has sort of been the proto version of this for Barclays to Barclays accounts, there is already a very strong corporate proposition where they're looking at files of payments, so a bulk file of payments to multiple recipients using mobile rather than account details. So accounts linked to mobile numbers securely and centrally will help to drive the use of that. I think for a normal business-to-business transaction, then we're going to stay along the lines of the faster payments, BACS, etc. So outside of just the payment types and the rails, there are other pieces of regulation which are still going to impact business. We've seen what's been called the RTI interim solution, when real-time information, so linking the payment with the taxation around that payroll payment, was originally envisaged. It was going to be one file going to BACS with all your tax and your payment information in it. That didn't go away with the interim solution. It was just parked, but we know that HMRC are very keen on bringing that back on the table, and that might completely change the way that payroll is made. So one file using ISO 20022 potentially. So there's another change in what you might need to do as a business. What we're seeing is more payment system consolidation and a different attitude towards payments. BACS will lose volume to faster payments. SEPA payments may take over from BACS payments. We're going to lose, so SEPA will take over from some SWIFT payments. CHAPS payments will disappear as the ceiling value of faster payments goes up. So there's a lot of change there. We'll see people move away from multiple point solutions to having central hubs. Now, this used to be the domain of the very large multinational corporate, especially given the attitude of banks and SWIFT to corporate adoption. But nowadays, we're seeing that coming much further down into the market. And I think a mistake that businesses have made is, and banks have made, is looking at businesses in terms of turnover and number of employees rather than their actual needs as a business. Now, James pointed out same-day loan companies consuming technology, very complex needs, using solutions which would have been marketed and proposed to much larger organisations. So removing risk is a very important external driver as well. As I mentioned before, people are starting to look at how they can protect themselves like a financial institution would against things like money laundering. We can also see that filtering and money laundering checking into BACS files will increase. We'll see the grey areas around regulation reducing as the new payments regulator comes in. So that's another recent announcement about the new payment system regulator run by the FCA, how they'll start to look at regulation and drive people to start to regulate properly and remove the grey areas. And as James was talking about, cloud payments will start to, and hosted solutions continue to increase as users become more familiar and trusting with this process. The more people host their treasured family photos to cloud deployment, we'll see more people trusting payments to those methods as well. And it was a battle 10 years ago when Bacstel-IP started getting people to trust the internet for payments, and now it's what people do. So in summary, I think I'd like to sort of lead with some questions for your business. Are you still relying on old technology and limited functionality? Is it still a PC in the corner for your business? Is someone still carrying data across on a disk or on a USB stick across the office to one PC that's not connected to your network? Now, your business has invariably grown in the last 10 years. Your requirements for payments have invariably changed. Has your actual technology? Are you making do? Are there more processes around that? Are you missing out on opportunities to automate and streamline your process? Have you considered how that could change the way that you operate? Are you manually reconciling your payments to understand your cash position? Are you taking reports of multiple systems to give you an idea what's gone out and then getting statements in from multiple bank solutions to work out your cash position? Do you have an easy way to get a single position at any one time? Is reconciliation still a manual tick and bash exercise? Have you thought that something like business-to-business direct debit could make your reconciliation much easier around your payment process? So in the last 10 years, financial transactions still form the lifeblood of organisations. We want people to think about the way that they make payments, how important payments are. And companies continue to ignore the need to revisit end-to-end process. So don't just look at payments in isolation as a point solution. Look at your order to cash, purchase to pay, payroll processes as a whole. So payments being one part of that. How can you improve the whole of that process? Very important. You may have built very impressive upstream workflow and processing in your ERP, but you end up throwing a file out the back end of the ERP which sits on your network in an unprotected folder, and you're allowing someone from IT to pick that file up on a daily basis, put it into a piece of desktop software, and press send. If you ignore the advances in technology in the way that disaster recovery, for example, can be delivered now compared to 10 years ago, organisations often find themselves in a position where nothing's that important, so payments are not that important until something goes wrong. And hopefully we've given you some good examples. That £85,000 example of a failed payroll hopefully has given you some food for thought. So we're encouraging organisations to implement flexible, efficient and secure payments infrastructure. This will provide the end-to-end cash visibility that's key in minimising risk and driving down costs and managing your business expansion. So looking at payment hubs, looking at routing your payments through one solution. Fraud will continue to be a problem, but the more that you validate bank details, you verify the people that you are doing business with, that you pay or collect from, the workflow in your process to make sure that internal fraud can't happen. Now, the profile of a fraudster within a business hasn't changed over the last 10 years. It is still someone in their mid-40s who's been with the business for 7 or 8 years and knows the processes. So just trusting one person like that company did with their payroll, the accountant with their payroll, isn't good enough. You need to build processes. Now, as you grow, outside influence might make you do that, but it's worth considering that anyway. But we would encourage businesses to take action now. Look sooner rather than later. There are legislation out there which is driving change. There's plenty of time plan to execute accordingly and to think strategically rather than tactically. So cloud deployment or thin client delivery might really assist your business in efficiency, might give you some operational efficiency and remove IT overheads. And these things are designed to protect you from change. So a cloud deployment may give you some a buffer against legislative change in file formats and the way that data is presented to different payment mechanisms. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and I'd like to open the floor to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is Sarge, guys. Thanks to the panel there for a very comprehensive overview of the UK and global payments landscape. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through some of the questions that we have from some of you guys. So to start with, this is for both James and Richard. We have a question from somebody who's asking what the ISO 2022 adoption in relation to that. What are the primary factors to make a business case for corporates and businesses?
I think, I said ISO 20022 is quickly becoming a standard for domestic payments, and one of the reasons is as a standard, it's easy to adapt multiple systems to it. Now, we worked with a large logistics company who have multiple bank relationships globally. So they were dealing with 10 different banks, and all of those banks were part of the CGI initiative. And what it meant was that through their central payment facility, they could produce one file format. Now, one file format reduces the cost of management. It's an accepted standard, so the bank account information always sits in the same place. The remittance information always sits in the same place. And even though there are some regional differences, there is a clear standard, and it gets away from having to manage multiple different countries' ways of making payments. So SEPA has seen the first sort of real change in that. Businesses having to move from domestic to international forms. In the UK, for example, that will move, hopefully, when if the UK payment systems adopt ISO 20022, as I mentioned, it will increase the amount of remittance information available in the file and other payment-specific information that's available.
Okay, fantastic. Another question we have here is from other attendees. How has the popularity of using the Bacs Bureau for transfer of files to Bacs changed over the years?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Bottomline have a Bacs Bureau as well as providing software and other solution types. And yeah, it's been interesting to see this over the last 10 years. We've seen a rise in Bacs Bureau traffic. But the other thing that's been interesting for Bacs Bureau is that it's been used as a form of disaster recovery, not just main production use. So, for example, organisations may well have on-premise Bacs solutions, but utilise Bacs Bureau as an alternative method in the event of their production availability going down. So it provides Bacs Bureaus have had to change over the years to establish themselves to set up people same day, just because this is, we're seeing large corporates use it, not just small to medium-sized organisations. So we've definitely seen that in our organisation over the last 10 years.
Great. Okay, another question we have here is does Bottomline have any examples that they can share about how business or treasury has fully utilised all the available new payment and invoicing technologies to gain a competitive advantage? So was there something in the structure, employees' lack of legacy or location that helped them kind of implement optimum payments procedures?
So I think we'll sort of return to the example of that large media company. Their major issue was they had lots of payments to make into various regions, but only for short periods of time. So they were relying on having multiple bank relationships and multiple bank solutions, and that increased the operations. So people had to learn 6 or 7 different bank terminals, for example. So they had people around the world that needed to pay, often on their payroll for very short periods of time, or contracts, or in difficult countries with difficult banking networks. So adopting SWIFT as a way of sort of reducing the differences between their payment types, which also helped them to keep the level of bank spread they had. So they have lots of different bank relationships because some banks are better at dealing with certain regions, so across the world, Africa, Asia, so they had to make payments in these countries. So they're able to reduce the number of people who were involved in manually making payments, reducing the amount of effort. There was a mitigation of fraud, although they didn't have a particular fraud problem. But all this was delivered on a client-server basis. So there was a server on site, but the payment screens could be delivered via a browser, so it can be operated from anywhere in the world. So any type of payment could be accessed. As I said, I think the advantages of what they did really were reducing the cost of managing multiple solutions, reducing the amount of people who have to know those solutions, giving them some real standards and some standard workflow. So whichever type of payment being made, whether it's BACS, SEPA, Faster Payments, CHAPS or SWIFT, the same process is in place in that business to do that, which means they can pay people a lot quicker. So not necessarily a competitive advantage, but saving a lot of money and time and effort.
Okay, great. And in relation to BACS there, another question we have, you may have touched on it before, but just to elaborate a bit more, how has the popularity of using BACS Bureau for transfer of files to BACS changed over the years?
Yeah, I think we just had that one. Yeah,
we've just had that one, right?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
There's another.
We're getting a few more BACS-related ones, though. So another one we have is it possible to transmit a BACS file direct to the bank instead of going via a BACS Bureau?
So with as a business, you've got a number of ways that you can get your payments to your bank. So your domestic UK payments. So one is you use e-bank software. So you're using internet banking. So you're uploading a file you're logging onto your bank's own portal, uploading a file to them. That gets sent to the bank. The bank then pass that on to the BACS network, who then process it. So there you had to upload a file into a proprietary network, possibly in a proprietary file format. That's gone to the bank, and the bank then pass that to BACS. There's also the bureau. So the bureau, you're passing a file to the bureau, they're passing it to BACS, or we think the most efficient way to do it is to actually send your file directly into the BACS network. So by going via a bank, so sending a BACS file directly to your bank, you're actually sort of adding another point, because the BACS network is there to sort things out for the banks. So direct to BACS is the most efficient way to go. And if you're multi-banked, then you only need one piece of BACS software. So you could be banked with 4 different banks. You only need one piece of BACS software. The BACS software will sort out the different file formats and put them into the BACS standard format and allow you to submit your files.
Okay, great. And we've got SWIFT and SEPA questions. So someone's asking here, if do banks use different SWIFTs for SEPA payments regarding domestic and cross-border? So can different SWIFTs be associated to an IBAN for a different type of payment?
So the banks use, for SEPA payments, are meant to use the ISO 20022 format. So that might go over the SWIFT network. Now, SEPA payments, if you have a bank account which is domiciled in Europe, you are meant to send from August, you will have to send your payment data to your bank in the ISO 20022 format, which means you need to use the IBAN, the data in that format. So you may have delivered your data in the old French domestic format to your bank before for payment, but then you will have to, from August, put that data into the ISO format. If your Euro bank account is domiciled outside of Europe, such as a Euro bank account with a UK bank that's domiciled in the UK bank, you can still present the data to them with domestic payment details, and the bank will possibly convert that data for you. What SEPA is meant to be is one file, so one standard way of making payments. What we've seen in the market, so broadly it's ISO 20022, it's a plain message. What we've seen, the banks will have slight variations around how they want to receive data. But IBAN is key in SEPA, and having that IBAN in there. So converting that domestic detail into the IBAN standard.
Okay, fantastic. And would anyone there be able to elaborate on how you see IBAN 2022, being used for non-payment type messages to provide visibility and control mechanisms for Treasury, i.e. for cash forecasting, bank statements, or reconciliation?
So with SEPA comes a separate set of messages. So outside of the payment message, there are also reconciliation messages as well. So there are some standards being brought in around the receipt of cash position and statement data. What we are seeing in the market is people are still using still over Swift getting sort of MT 940, 942 messages, because that's the standard that most treasury systems understand. So people typically using, even if they're submitting to SEPA using the ISO 20022 formats, they're still expecting 940 and 942 messages back from the bank.
Okay, great. Another question we have here is Swift related. So as Swift's dominance as the international B2B de facto payment mechanism diminishes, how does the panel view competitive offerings which decouple the payment from a need to connect to a bank or for an FI such as SAP's FSN or as an alternative?
So that's an interesting question. That SAP's move into this market hasn't, it's been talked about for a while. I know it's been become more prevalent this year. So Swift will always be there because it's a bank-to-bank space, and typically where so as the banks own Swift, banks will typically push people towards that. So it's going to be corporates who drive the use of those networks rather than banks. So banks may say, well, they offer some support. I think businesses, in terms of business-to-business payment, still like to, ultimately the payment's going to end up in a bank, so still like to use the bank rails. But as we've seen with personal payments, this is, we're moving away from that bank-heavy approach. But there's still a network that needs to be used, and the Swift network is still connecting, still has the widest reach. So yes, we can see some movement of traffic away from that traditional Swift network into something like FSN. I don't see that becoming sort of too disruptive to Swift because the banks drive this. The banks have invested in Swift, and proprietary systems. People's ERPs, including SAP, are geared to, and treasury management systems are geared towards that Swift network. So if they're using the Swift standards across those networks, then you're going to see a bit of movement. But ultimately, you still need a bank account. You still need to put money into that bank.
Are we good to do one last question? We've had some good responses here. One last one from one of our attendees is how widely are validation and verification solutions behind adoption, and what are some of the barriers yet to be overcome?
So that's a great question. So we're seeing validation is easily done in the UK because there's a nice standard set of rules, sort of an account number rules. So people are using that's part and parcel of making BACS payments as well. So further upstream, where people are doing direct debits, we see that people are increasingly looking to integrate validation to systems. We're seeing that verification is becoming much more important. So Bottomline, like a few other organisations, offer verification solutions. Verification becomes key in terms of KYC. So knowing your customer, and the verification that we support is basically linking a person to their bank account. That's not available for all bank accounts. It becomes more important. Barriers behind adoption, I think sometimes people don't see a good reason to have verification until they get hit by big indemnity claims. So once again, this is until the problem happens, and they're willing to, if the banks are willing to let people do things like paperless direct debit without having sufficient verification as well, that's also a problem. One area we really like to see increase in business, the credit reference agencies, the other people who control data, is around business verification as well. We have seen an uptick in invoice fraud, and that's where I would write to an organisation, say, I'll use the example of a large chocolate manufacturer and a large supermarket. So I write to the large supermarket to say, I am large chocolate manufacturer, let's say my name begins with M, and I've just changed my bank accounts. In future, can you pay any invoices to the following bank account? That letter would have been completely fictitious, and the bank account would have been a personal bank account. So to stop that happening, we would like to see banks help organisations link bank accounts to bank accounts to businesses and say this is definitely a business bank account, this definitely belongs to this business. So while we've got that for large majority of people, we don't have that for the large majority of businesses. But there are lots of validation and verification solutions available. Ours, we like to think, is obviously the best, and it's suitable for for any scale of business.
Okay, fantastic. And finally, as we come towards the end of this webinar, is there anything that you'd like to add or stress at this point, James and Richard?
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, hopefully this has been useful for the audience, and I think that the question from Bottomline that we pose throughout this is, what is your payment strategy, and are you clear on it? As we've gone through the last hour, we've talked about many reasons why you'll have tactical initiatives to just simply do like-for-like replacements of your ability to either connect to Bacs or connect to your bank and all of those things. But some of the most successful organizations have a payment strategy that aligns to the growth of their business. And this, for us, is what we're talking about at the moment, and a big part of Bottomline's proposition.
Okay, fantastic. So I'd just like to say thank you to both Richard and James for taking us through that today, and thank you to Bottomline Technologies for hosting this in conjunction with Bobsguide. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the slides, or you feel like there's anything you want to catch up on, we will be sending over recordings, and the slides should be available as well. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you all the best from here from Bobsguide as well as from Bottomline Technologies.